Hello, everyone. Hello. I am Tiffany Chang. I'm a developer here at Odoo. I've been at Odoo for almost 6 years now, and I split my time between the logistics and the I-18N teams. And today I'm going to talk to you about the translations parts. No, very little logistics stuff, I promise. So today, here are some of the things we're going to cover. So first we're going to start with what's the difference between I-18N and what's the difference with L10N, and what do these things even mean? Because a lot of people, they don't know what does it mean, but they see it in our code and they always wonder. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the translations workflow works within Odoo. That is probably going to be a little more relevant to actual translators or people who want to do translations, whereas after that I'll talk more about the I-18N structure, which will be more technical and a little more targeted towards developers, but it doesn't hurt for translators to listen to it as well, because it might explain to them why some things aren't translated when they expect them to be translated. And then after that, there'll be the common issues that I see in code and that we often have to correct, or that we've already corrected in the past, but might be applicable to people who are doing third-party apps, or people who want to contribute to Odoo code, things like that. And then just a little summary of everything that I covered. So let's first start with I-18N and L10N. So I-18N is internationalization, which is actually a word that's really hard for me to say, even as a native speaker. So what the people who are much better at coding than me came up with is I-18N, where the 18 stands for all the letters between the I and the N to shorten it. So that way, whenever people look at code, they don't have to write this giant word every single time. And L10N is localization, so 10 letters between the L and the N. And so within Odoo, we have both. So the I-18N, I think of it as our general framework of how we translate things in general in all of Odoo. You can use it in any module for the most part, with a few exceptions. For example, like how you specifically translate email templates or websites. That's a little more specific to those modules, but anything that builds off of those modules can also use it. For the L10N, those are the things where it's logic specific to a country or region. So for example, accounting has a lot of L10N, where it's things such as what are the tax codes for that specific country, what are the specific names you have to use, things like that, and what are the government requirements for reporting your taxes. And then we also have the payroll. With payroll, they have a lot of things that are specific to that country as well. And I'm not really going to cover how to do either of those today, but there were already talks during the previous days, so if you want to learn more about how to develop those yourself, you should go onto our website, and I believe we have all of the videos will be streamable later on after the Odoo experience is over. And so I wanted to show some examples. So L10N, the localization. I chose Belgium because I know it a bit better than the other ones. So here in Belgium, for those who don't know, there's a lot of taxes in Belgium, and so we have a lot of extra benefits to get around those taxes as much as possible. So for non-Belgians, they make almost no sense. The first time I started talking for doing interviews here, people would say like, oh yeah, but what about the benefits? Like, you talk about you want this much salary, but how many benefits you want? And I had no idea what they were talking about. So if a business wanted to come and start hiring people in Belgium, they might not know all of the things that are required to hire people in Belgium. And that's why we have a localization that does it for you. And so, for example, here we have things like eco-vouchers as a very Belgian thing where you get extra money that's not taxed to spend every year. So that's on top of your regular salary, things like that. And we specifically here have the Belgian salary configurator because since we're a Belgian company, we make a lot of offers to people. And so this is one of the ways to make it easier to make an offer to people and make it very transparent of how much does Odoo offer, especially based on your experience and things like that. And then companies can configure it however they want for their specific needs and their specific offerings. It's the same thing for the Belgian balance sheet. I have some teammates who've worked on it quite a bit. And with that, you really have to make sure that you have the right numbers and the right account names. And especially in Belgium, you have to worry about it being in the right languages because Belgium has 3 national languages. Whereas I-18N, with this, we're more focused on things like, oh, what languages can I select? Is it correctly loading the language that I expect it to be? Can I translate my email so that when I send it to a specific customer, is it in their language? Is it in my language? At what point should it be their language? What part should it be my language? Things like that. And it's also especially useful for things like websites. For people who want to have international companies, you need to make sure that your website shows up in different languages and that it's correct in those languages and things like that. Because I'm sure a lot of us have been to websites before and then you see the translation and you think, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why did they write that? Or there'll be code in the website, things like that. So a little bit more about how Odoo does its translations is we use the concept of PO and POT files, which are portable objects and portable object template files. For those who have already done localization things before in other software or just using it within Linux, these are very standard things where the template file is the one that says, these are all the things I need to translate. And then the PO file is a copy of that. And then for that specific language, it says, this term translates to this term translates to this. And these PO files are typically named based on the language that it's targeted towards. And one of the things that includes is that you have to think a bit about how languages around the world differ by country and things like that. So for example, French, we have Belgian French, we have Canadian French, we have Swiss French. And within Odoo, because we're a very international facing company, we typically translate everything in standard, just regular French. We don't specify a country. And then that way, if we want to update a translation for one term, it'll show up for all three. Whereas if you need to have something specific, like for example, I know one that we've had problems with is credit note in French is different in France than it is in Belgium. So what we do is we use the French one in standard French, and then in Belgian French, we update it to the correct term according to what Belgians expect. So that's why here I have the baselang. The baselang in this case would be French. And then we only go country specific when you have to have something specific to that country. But we do have a couple exceptions because languages are always complicated. And some of the exceptions I listed here are Chinese, because you have simplified Chinese and you have traditional Chinese, and they are not mutually intelligible. So you cannot have one be based on the other one when a translation is missing. We also have the same problem with Spain Spanish and Latin American Spanish. And then another fun exception that we have, since it was decided before I ever started at Odoo what the list of languages that we offer are, we have Serbian, and Serbian is a language that is handled both in Latin script and in Cyrillic. And there's a few languages like this, and because of that, you have to specify which one it is. So if you look within the Odoo code base, you might see things where it says SR at Latin, because it's specifically the Latin Serbian. And sometimes we have to add in extra checks for it. So if you do it for other languages where you have other special needs, Odoo might not specifically handle that language correctly, and you might have to add on your own special handling for it, because we only have a certain base number of languages right now that we currently handle, and even then sometimes they're not that popular, so we don't know there are problems with them until it comes up. Yeah. And so the way we do our translations for our actual translators is that we have a server made with WebBlade. We were previously using Transifex, but we recently switched to WebBlade. And this is our website for if you want to be a community translator, or if you want to just see, does a translation exist, or is a translation missing, you can go on there. I believe right now you don't even need an account. You can just see all of the projects. You won't be able to make any translations without an account. And right now we have in-house Odoo translators at this point. So for languages that are not currently in our project list, it's because we do not have an in-house translator, nor do we have a partner who says they're willing to do the translations. So if you want to do any translations, you're welcome to go to this website. Up top we say when you log in, once you create an account, you can email us, and then we will activate that language for you, and then we will set you as someone who can translate for it. Because we want to keep it separated to make sure that no one goes and translates a language they don't actually speak. So, some tips for translators. So one of the biggest problems for our translators is all they see is something like this, the message ID. And for them, a lot of them don't code. So they see it and they go, okay, I don't understand, what do I need to translate? What does this mean? Sometimes they'll just see something that says save. They don't know, is this save like something that I have saved? Am I going to save? Things like that. And this is a problem we regularly have where there's no context. And because there's no context, depending on the language, it might be different words. One example that I have that comes up a lot is table, because you have a physical table, and then you also have a data table. And in a lot of languages, it's different, but in English, it's one word. So for the translators, they're a little bit out of luck because they have to think, okay, table, which table? I don't know, there's like 5 words for table, depending on my language. So what I recommend is you have to look at the module. So for example, if you saw a table in stock, you know, okay, stock, that's inventory. That means it's probably not a data table, it's probably a physical table. In some cases, if it's something where it could be a verb or a noun, sometimes, unfortunately in Odoo, it's both. And then you just have to guess which word will be better to use that will bother people the least, unfortunately. So like the example I gave with the save, if it's just a single word, typically it's probably going to be a verb, but you have to look a bit at these code or model things that you see up here and kind of guess based on the name what it may or may not be. So for example, this one says stock, mail, template, data, blah, blah, blah. That means this is probably going to be in an email template. So you have the context of it's in an email, it's in inventory. Okay, so that means that delivery order is probably something specific to sending something in stock and making sure that the customer knows that they've received it. Another problem that I often see for some languages is gendered nouns. So for example, in French, you have le, la, and sometimes we have things where you don't know what's going to be put in there. So for example, reference object name. Object name could be different nouns. So it might be masculine, it might be feminine, and you don't know which one it's going to be. So what we recommend people do is to do something where they just put slashes. It's not great for some languages, like German has 3 genders, which means you're going to have to do all 3, but at least it'll be accurate, and it won't confuse and bother people as much when they see something and go, well, that's not masculine, that's obviously feminine, they don't know how to speak French. Another problem that we often see is code within the translations. And when it's actual code, it can't be translated because it will break. We see this a lot in email templates. For example, something like this might get translated as object company ID name into some other language, and then when Odoo tries to read it, it'll say, well, that doesn't exist in the code, I can't open this now. So the 3 main things that you'll see for code, there might be more because there's always lots of exceptions, are these things called like placeholders and the string placeholders. So whenever you see something where it's %s or %s or something in 2 curly braces, that means it's probably code and you probably shouldn't translate it. But there are exceptions, and unfortunately you just kind of have to look and get a feel for it. So for example, in here it says object name or NA, so not available in English, and you have to know, okay, I have to translate NA into my language version of not applicable and not available. Another big problem we've been having a lot more recently is people using auto-translators. It's perfectly fine to use an auto-translator, but you have to double check, because often it'll translate code, and it doesn't have the context, so it'll translate it to the wrong thing. So another example of that we saw recently that made us laugh, but looks really bad for the customers, is there was a unit of measure or something like that was PA. And obviously PA does not mean dad, but the auto-translator didn't know that, so several people started seeing unit of measure, dad. So we had to go in and fix it because the auto-translator didn't know, and when you see things already pre-translated, it's really easy for your brain to say, well, of course, pa is dad, so the translation is correct. But you have to be a little more careful than that, because it's really jarring for the customers when they actually see it in the code and when they're actually using the software. And then the last one is more for when people are translating directly within the backend. So for example, you have a product, you've given it several translations depending on what language is looking at it, and then they'll duplicate it. And then they will only change the name in one language and they won't change it in the others, which means that, let's say for example, you have chocolate ice cream, and then you translate it into several languages, and then you duplicate it, and then you make strawberry ice cream, but then you don't retranslate it. So in all the other languages, it'll still say chocolate ice cream, which can be really confusing for customers as well, because then they'll say, well, I didn't order chocolate ice cream. Why are you sending me chocolate ice cream when I ordered strawberry? So these are just things to watch out for. All right, so now I'm going to go more into the meat. So some of the limitations. As I mentioned before, we don't cover translation context. This is a thing that's normally standard in major projects that do translations, but within Odoo, we haven't found that there's enough of a need in order to add it in. So we just haven't. And unfortunately, it just means some things like, for example, scrap. We can't say scrap in this case is a verb, scrap in this case is a noun, which is standard in other things, but not within Odoo. Because for each term, all of these things will use the same term and the same translation. The other thing that we don't cover is plural support. So in English, it's very easy. For the most part, we just add ES or S, and we could just put it in parentheses and say apple, apples, as one thing. But for some languages, the example we always go to is Arabic, is that in English we have one, many. In Arabic, there's 0, 1, many, few. So they have several different ways that they can pluralize things. So for them, it's not possible to translate something like apples with an S in a parentheses. And unfortunately, we don't cover that right now either. So it's something that their translators just have to kind of do their best effort to make sure that it makes sense in their language. Another issue we often see is in multilingual companies. If, let's say, we have users who speak French and users who speak Dutch, when they do some actions, it'll generate it only in their language. The example that comes up a lot is in the chatter. When you do something, it'll say something like purchase order created. But it'll be in the language of the person who created it, which means when the next person looks at it, they'll see it and go, okay, I don't understand French. I don't know why it's in French. Is there something that can be done? And the answer is no, because it would be extremely complicated to keep the translation for all of those within the chatter message record. And there's a few other cases like that as well, where if you really want to, you can hack it to get it to work, but it's going to be a lot of effort and it might be a little buggy. And then the other limitation we have is for JavaScript translations. As of version 19, so if this has been a big problem for you, I highly recommend you upgrade. We added in context based on the module for JavaScript, because we had this within Python. So for example, if you had a specific translation in stock, it would only be used in stock. In JavaScript, it would load all of the translations into one big dictionary, and whatever was the last translation for that specific term was the translation it would use everywhere, which means the table example that I gave earlier was always a problem because people would always say, well, why is it showing me table in spreadsheet? I don't understand a table, a physical table, and not a data table. And we couldn't fix it because that's just the way it was loaded into memory. But with 19, it was changed, and so hopefully we won't be running into that problem as much anymore. And yes. So I'm going to go a little bit faster because I'm talking too much. So now I'm going to get into the more complicated part about translations within Odoo. So there's 3 types of translation things within our pod files. We've got the model, the code, and the model terms. And I'm going to go through each one a little more quickly. So the model is what's stored in the database. So for this, it's things such as the field, if you have a string label for it. If you have records, such as some demo data, I've got my customizable desk. It's also things like that are automatically translated, like the help of the field. And if you want to do something like, for example, name, I want to be able to translate the name of my products. Then you add in this try, translate equals true, and then it's also stored in the database as a JSON-B, where it'll say, okay, in English it's this, and then all the other languages that you need, it'll have that stored as well in the database. We also have the email templates. And then one of the limitations about the model I wanted to point out is that because it's based on what's in the database, that means when you inherit and you overwrite an existing record in another module, that means that you might only be able to translate the last thing that you inherited. So one of the examples I give for this is that in accounting, they have different groups. And depending on if you have only invoicing installed, so the community version, versus the accounting enterprise version, it'll overwrite the names of those particular groups. So it becomes something like bookkeeper, and then bookkeeper becomes accountant, or something like that. I don't remember the exact specifics, but it meant we can only translate one of those at a time because it's the same exact record in the database. So that's actually a problem that some of you have maybe seen before, and unfortunately there's not really much we can do about it because that's just the way it's stored. This other little thing I put here, in case anyone ever needs it, is we've, by default, we export all of the fields based on the name of the field or the string of the field. So if you don't have a string that's specific for that field, it'll auto-generate a label. as many of you have probably noticed, when you add a new field into Odoo, it displays something. And there is some logic where what it does is it removes any underscores. If there's ID, it'll remove the ID at the end of the name, and then it'll just use the rest as a name. And sometimes people create technical fields, and they don't want it to be translated, or maybe you have someone on your team who's not very good at naming fields, and then people won't be able to figure out what it means, but the translators will see it. So if you don't want them to translate it, you can always add this export string translate equals false, so that it won't be exported. But I should warn you that if anyone uses Studio or tries to filter on it, it's still going to show whatever auto-generated name it is, and it won't be translatable. So I just recommend have really good field names, and then everyone will be happier and life will be easier for everyone. Also, sorry, I should point out, when I was saying that there's these 3 types, you can tell which one you're looking at, because within the pod file, it will specify this is a model translation. And then that's how you can see what it matches to and all the stuff I said earlier. So code translations are probably the easiest thing that we have. Some of you have probably seen that we have this underscore and then parentheses and some string that you want to translate. We have the same thing in JavaScript, except it's underscore T. As of 18, we now have the self environment underscore, which I will explain a bit more later. And then we also have the lazy translate, which I say use only if you think you really, really need it, but overall you probably don't need it. It's only used in very special occasions where you won't have the context of the language that you're supposed to be using, and in which case lazy translate, it's kind of like most lazy loading within programming, where it'll load it when it needs it. And then for JavaScript, because of the way, since it's all on the front end, we include the OWL templates, and they're also treated as more of a code translation than an actual regular, let's say, form view translation or email template translation. So you should consider anything related to the JavaScript side of Odoo as a code translation. And then within the JavaScript attributes, you can add in this .translate. So for example, if you have something like title equals something, and then you pass it as a props into your OWL component, then you should add the .translate to make sure that it knows, okay, I should also export the string to be translated, otherwise it won't be translatable. And one of the ways that you see this is when it's exported, you will see that it has this Odoo JavaScript or this Odoo Python. And it's quite important that when you export your pod file that it has these, because if it doesn't, it won't know that this is a code translation. And then it won't know to load it when it loads all of the backend translations or the front-end translations. And when I say backend and front-end, I mean Odoo Python, backend, Odoo JavaScript, front-end translations. OK, and so the trickiest one are the model terms, which actually confuse me, even though I've been looking at them for the past year and a half. So the model terms are when you have XML and HTML data. Identifying which ones it'll be. So I gave kind of these general rules of it's usually reports and HTML fields and web pages, but sometimes there's exceptions depending on how you've done your code. And with these, it matches based on the source. And by that I mean this message ID. So for example, if for some reason you want to make a change in your code and it's stable, so people already have that in their database, if you change something like this, where you say the finest open word blah, 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 you change it to the newest open word furnitures, anyone who already has the finest open word furnitures, it's not going to be able to match a translation anymore, because now the source doesn't match what's in your latest code and in your pod file, if you're keeping your pod file up to date. So this sounds like it's a bad idea, but in some cases it's actually useful. So for example, when you have your website and you edit your website, sometimes people forget they need to update their translations. So that means you might change it in English, and then later on in French, it's referring to the old string, and then it doesn't make any sense anymore. I've seen this before in within Odoo.com, some of our events. People were copying the records, it had the old translations, they'd change it to something else in English, and then it wouldn't change it back to English in the other languages, and then it was just complete confusion, because it would be talking about a completely different event in a different language. But this was changed in, I forget which version, I'm going to say at least 18, where now it'll just automatically delete it, but before that it won't necessarily automatically delete it. The other thing I mentioned here is that it's split by elements. So this example that I have here from HTML, it's from an event. And as you can see, it has some like paragraphs and breakpoints, things like that, or new lines. And so what our model terms do is it'll break it out by HTML groups. So you can see here that this part, the finest open word furniture, is split into one section, and then the end this time, blah, 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 it's split into another section, which means that you can change some things without affecting the translations of other things. And it also means if for some reason you didn't finish doing all your translations, something might only be half translated, something like that. So I just wanted to point out for people who are doing the development that as Odoo grows, we have a lot more developers, and we have a lot more developers who are more passionate about making sure that their translations are better. So things have changed over time, and not everything will be available in every single version. So the OWL templates being translatable by adding the .props, adding the .translate, that's been added into OWL, and since OWL was pushed to all versions of Odoo, it's available in all versions of Odoo already, all supported versions of Odoo, I should say. And then in Odoo 17, as some of you have probably seen, we have all of these industries, and one of the problems we had is because they're treated as data modules, that means they weren't being translated. So we added in more support so that data modules can have translations within them. But I should point out that it's only if the language is already installed on that database and then they import it that it'll actually import the translations for that specific language. And if you make changes to your data module later on, if the customer didn't already have the translation at the time, they won't necessarily get it later on because it's not handled like a normal module update. And I also say it's partly translatable because there's some parts that are currently not translatable. So any sort of custom code translations, I believe right now will not be covered. Because right now it's only focused more on the model terms translations, and I think that's it. We will hopefully make it better, but it's a tricky problem, unfortunately. I also wanted to emphasize again the self-environment get text that I mentioned earlier. That's only an 18 plus. And that one is extremely useful because what happens with that is it helps keep the language context. So there's a few edge cases that I'm going to mention later on where that solves that problem. In 18.2, this is interesting for people who develop the L10N modules. You can now add translations directly into XML data files. And the reason why this was needed so badly is because when it comes to L10N development, typically there's very specific government terms you need to use, and you don't want to translate it. And you don't want them to be able to edit it because it's a specific mandated government term. Maybe it doesn't make sense to normal people, but it's what the government wants. So now you can add it in. But with the caveat that you must make sure you put it in correctly. So you have to say the language that it's specifically for. You have to write the language code correctly. And once you add it in, it will no longer be exported as part of the pot file. So that means, for example, with the Swiss accounting, that means if you added in all the French translations, but you didn't add in the German translations, it's not going to export, and you need to know to go look in the data file to make sure that you add them all in manually. This was also done because, as you saw with the pot file, it kind of exports them in alphabetical order, which means, and it's everything in that module. In this case now, when the developer is working on it, they can see in context and see, okay, it's this account from this number. I could just type in the translation that the government wants. Done. Next one. And they can make sure that they don't forget any records. In 18.3, there were two other small improvements as well. There's you can now pass lists as something to be injected into the placeholders. And it'll automatically detect the language that your current environment is using. And because of that, it'll put in the correct list punctuation. Because in English we use comma, but not all languages use commas. And by default, it will also add in and translated into whatever language you're currently using. If you need to be more specific than that or not use, for example, a comma before the and, things like that, then you can also look, we have a i18n tools file, and in there you can just directly call and then say which ones you want to use. So for example, instead of and, just don't use and, just put commas, things like that. And then within QWeb, you can also now add translate into that for the attributes and value f and all static attributes, because sometimes people will also just inject strings in there and then not realize that it's not going to be translated. Now, if you see, okay, this thing's not translatable, just add in that .translate. And one thing to mention here is that if there's Python code within any of these attributes, it'll automatically remove them to be translated because you don't want injection, of course. And then again, 19, the JavaScript namespacing. I really emphasize it because we get a lot of translation complaints about things being translated as the wrong word, and all we can say is, sorry, there's nothing we can do. You can uninstall the module with the wrong translation in it, but that's it for now. Okay, so some of the common issues. I mentioned them a little bit earlier, the lists, joining them. This is a common pattern that you'll see in Odoo, where they'll do this, but it's not necessarily correct if that language doesn't use commas. But there's nothing the translators can do to change it because it's hard-coded into the code. Split strings are also a big problem. So for example, people might sometimes do, oh, your purchase order is, and then depending on the situation, it'll say, if this, then add on this extra string. If this, add on this extra string. But the problem is there's a lot of languages where you have to rearrange the sentence. And when you split them like that, that means that the person translating it is going to see, oh, your purchase order is, and then they'll see on another line, ready, or delayed, things like that. And what that means is that when someone, for example, who's translating into German and they need to put the verb at the end, they can't because the sentence has been split and there's nothing they can do. And then they have to do something weird that will never look natural to a German person, or a German speaker. Another issue is the unnamed placeholders. So here you can see I mentioned before, these are code things. And this %s means that it's going to be a string that's injected there. But the problem is, this is what we see in the code, and this is what the translator sees. So they have no idea what these s's are going to be, and they can't rearrange them. Because they're both s's, it's just going to do it in the same order, which means in some languages it'll be wrong because the order will be wrong, and there's nothing the translator can do. So what we did, this is old code. This is from, I think, 16 or 17. What we did is that now we already went through and did a cleanup where we replaced anything that's like this with name placeholders. So what happens is when the translators see this, they will see %list of refunds s refund. This is just an example. I don't remember if it's actually in the code, but it means that now they can see this and go, okay, it's going to be a list. I should adjust refund so that it matches correctly. And it also means that now they can rearrange it if they need to. So it's good to have a placeholder that makes sense, but at minimum, there should be some sort of placeholder so that they can rearrange it if they need to. Another issue is non-translatable strings, which I'm going to talk a little bit more later. Another issue I've seen a few times is font size can sometimes get a little strange for non-Latin languages. This mostly comes up in website, and with that, you have to do extra styling to make sure that things don't overlap, or that, typically the issue is they overlap due to the size not being correct, and then it looks really bad in that language. Another thing that comes up is date format. People often forget that date format depends on where you're from, and that needs to be based on the language environment, because that's one of the fields that you can set on a particular language. So for example, the difference between European English and American English, we change the order of the date and the month, and that can create huge confusion between people. And so that's why it's quite important that you remember to do that, because often people who want to use a specific date format that's not the same as the US, they will actually use that language, and it should show correctly. So keep that in mind. And another one that comes up occasionally is right to left languages. So Arabic, Hebrew, maybe some other languages that I'm not sure about. You have to sometimes add in extra logic to make sure you handle the right to left. So one of the examples that came up before is there's a chart within stock, and it would draw a line with an arrow, but when you used Arabic, the arrow was facing the wrong way. And so it looked really stupid, but it was a really simple fix where we just had to detect that the language is right to left and just make sure that it flips it, and that's all. So it's one of those things where you can test by just installing Arabic, seeing what happens, and seeing if everything looks okay. But if you don't target right to left language customers, then it's maybe not too important. So with the non-translatable strings, this is something that we often see and we often have to fix, which is someone will put some sort of code and they'll have it push out some sort of string. But the problem is, because this is code, it'll never be translated, because why would we export code to be translated? So what you have to do is you have to set it as a variable, put it specifically in as a normally exported string, and then inject it into your code. But I should also point out that it depends a lot on which type of translation you're looking at. So is it a model or a model term? Because with model terms, sometimes it will include the code. With records, so models, the models will include the whole thing. So for example, in email templates, it will export the entire template, which means you don't have to worry about whether or not it includes code that injects strings depending on the situation. But with model terms, you do, because it's going to remove them. The other very common thing we see, and something we watch out for in our PRs, any PRs that we review, is don't forget to add in the get text. And the get text is the underscore, and specifically try to use the self.environment._. And same thing within the JavaScript to make sure that you've actually made it so the thing is translatable. And the last one is make sure that your pod file is up to date, because that is what it's looking for, to see is there something to translate. And if it doesn't have it in the pod file, it won't know what they're translated to. And your PO files won't necessarily match up with your pod file, and then it just won't be translatable, and the translators are confused, and yeah. And so the self-environment underscore again, the reason why we have that now is because it makes sure that you have the correct language environment, and this came up a lot when people would inject, they would use the get text within list generator. Because the problem is that when you do a list generator, it creates a separate stack, and that stack might not necessarily have the same language in this environment. And within Odoo, we have some sort of catch-alls where it tries to guess, okay, did someone manually set a language in the context? No? Okay. Let's see, is there one that's the general one? No, okay, let's try this one, and then it'll eventually default to just, I think, English or whatever the main language of the database is. Which means sometimes you end up with weird things where things that aren't translated, but you think, oh, well, I put my get text, why isn't it working? And it's because of that. There's some other situations that are more use case specific, where, for example, let's say you're making purchase orders and you want to send an email to that partner after you've confirmed it and everything, and they speak another language from you. You sometimes want to make sure, for example, that the product is in their language, and with that, you have to make sure that you set it in the context to use the language of that partner. In this case, destination address ID is a partner, so it'll look for their language. If it can't find one, default back to whoever is using it, because it's better to have some text than no text, even if it's the wrong language. You can also do something similar within the email templates directly as well, where you just set the tlang. And there's also some other helper things like render lang that you can use to call on an email template to make sure it uses the right language. And then lastly, the code generated records. This one is a little bit more of an edge case, but it's also just as important. So sometimes within Odoo, we will generate a record using code, and then we'll use a get text. But the problem is that in this case, it's only going to translate it to the specific language that you're generating it with at that time. And that means even though it's a record and you think, oh, well, it's a record, I've translated it, it should show up in all the languages when I switch my language, it won't necessarily do that because it's generated just with that one string of the language at that time. A couple of examples of this are the account journals. So for example, sometimes you'll have bank, so you made your database in French, it'll say banque correctly, but then someone who's another language speaker will look at it and they'll go, why is it in French? I don't understand. I can click, I can change the translation, so why isn't it already translated? And it's because of the specific problem. And there are hacks you can do to get around this, where you force load the language after the creation, but it gets a bit messy, so I recommend that normally you just try to do the traditional, you already have a record, you create it based on that record, and then it'll be correctly translated. Okay, so since I'm running out of time, the conclusion is, remember, the translators are the ones who are going to have to actually look at it later on, and all they have is the pod file. Unless they're a programmer, it's often hard for them to figure out what does this mean, where is it coming from, what's the context. So try to give them as many clues as possible is what I recommend. Also to remember to think outside the box. Not every language is like English. A lot of Western languages are very similar, but a lot of non-Western languages are not. So you have to remember, okay, there's probably edge cases that I might be missing. And then when you're not sure, you should always just export the pod file to see, okay, the way I wrote this, will it be several different terms that they have to translate, or will it be one big one? And also, yeah, things like that. So I think we need to move on to the Q&A because it's already the last 9 minutes. If we're ready.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. It was a very interesting topic.
Oh,
so
thanks.
much to know. So much.
Yes, I probably missed some things too, just to warn everyone, because it's such a huge thing in Odoo and everyone does their own specific things for their specific use cases.
And we have a few questions as well. So the first one is linked to some of the pitfalls you were mentioning. What if a word has a different translation depending on the context? Like for example, scrap is a verb in view form, but is a noun in a view list. But we only have one message ID.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. You just have to pick the one that's probably going to be used the most, or the one that'll be the least offensive to whoever looks at it later on, because we only have the one translation for that one term.
There's no other way to...
If you're the actual developer, you can try to word it in a different way so that it's actually a different term. Like that came up recently with review in accounting, where review means one thing, but you also want to be able to click to say that you're going to review something, so they just worded it differently. I don't know what they used, but they tried something else. Yeah.
Cool. Are there any plans to translate chatter messages?
No. It's been asked, but the answer is no, because it's too complicated, and chatter messages are already extremely optimized because there's so many, and it's hard to keep track of all of them in the database.
And a lot of people want to know what's going to happen. Any plans to improve the interface for the translation in the backend?
In the backend, well, we do still have to get rid of the old transifex module. We haven't had time because the whole transition to WebBlade was last month, and we were all preparing for Odoo experience, so none of us had time to work on it. But we do plan on updating that to actually match our WebBlade instance, and also to improve WebBlade. But in terms of changing how the translations work within Odoo, we don't have any plans right now.
Cool. Thank you very much for that answer. What is the best way to report the untranslatable terms? Updating the PO file does not update the terms in the UI.
So to report things that don't seem to be translatable, you can either, if you're a programmer, you can open up a PR, and then the team associated with it will review and see if it makes sense. Otherwise, if you're not a programmer, you can report it in our feedback. We have some sort of feedback. I think it's feedback@odoo.com or something like that. And then hopefully the appropriate team will get it again.
Cool, thank you. Someone was asking for an example of owl prop translation.
An example, oof. Well, usually it's things like some sort of title or some sort of string that they want to inject at some point. But then they forget that it's technically some code, so it's not going to be considered. So I don't have any off the top of my head, but if you look within Odoo, if you just search in all the JavaScript files for .translate, you're probably going to find a bunch of examples, because whenever we come across the issue, we just add it in.
So if we want to translate a prop, we do the .translate.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Why is it so difficult to translate? The exported PO or POT files are not back importable. There is no error message, but it is not updating the string. But the OCA ones always seems to be okay.
I'm not quite sure what they mean, because unless I see the specific example, it's hard for me to tell. So when you update the translations within our WebBlade instance, we have a sync that will sync it into our PO files, and then customers will have to reload the language once they have it pushed to their code. But it should be loading it fine. I don't know why they'd be getting an error. There is a problem where sometimes people will manually edit the pod files or the PO files, and if they edit it incorrectly, then it will break. If you have a duplicate term, automatic break because it's not expected. Same thing with the PO files, and often when people manually edit them, they'll just add on to the bottom of the list, which means it's really hard to keep track if you have a duplicate, which is why we always tell within Odoo, do not manually update your pod files, because there's a good chance you'll break it.
Cool. The person did add while you were talking, I mean the export from the UI.
Oh yes.
That helps.
So exporting the pod file from the UI, it shouldn't throw an error, but so in the past, it used to be that you could export the pod file, write your own translations, and upload it. But in version 16, it was changed so that now only some things will be translated when you re-upload the PO file. There were some people who were very upset about it, but it was not a me decision, so don't get mad at me. So yeah, unfortunately, there's some things that you just can't manually translate yourself anymore, and the expectation is if a translation is wrong, you should submit a suggestion or translate it yourself within our WebBlade instance to say, this translation's wrong, set it to this.
If I translate a word, quote, project to, quote, X, the AI will know what X is, or would I have to use project in my prompt?
I don't know what you mean by changing it to X.
If I translate a word project to X, yeah.
Okay, so I don't know much about the AI auto translation stuff because it's another team that handles that. So maybe, don't know.
Do you have another question? Do you have example of embed translation in XML?
Embedded translation in XML. I'm not sure what that means. If they could be more specific.
And also, if I don't ask your question right, feel free to ask Tiffany after the talk. She's really knowledgeable. So, how to import translation to my own WebPlate instance?
So that you should look at the WebBlade documentation, but you can always download all of our PO files and just upload them yourself into your WebBlade instance.
When I have a custom module with translation, I need to update the translation from my language manually. Is there an auto update function, or is there a plan to include it?
We do not auto update because sometimes people will do their own translations and we don't want to overwrite their own, which is why if we get a bug fix saying this translation's wrong, we'll put it in and we'll say reload the language and it'll show up the way you want it to. But otherwise, it's up to the users.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, Tiffany. We went through all the questions, but again, feel free to ask Tiffany after the talk. And thank you very much for this amazing talk.
Yep, and thanks for your attention.